Okay, so good morning, everyone. I haven't said good morning to all of you watching Global Hands-on Universe this morning or afternoon or night, wherever you are in the world. With 70 countries, it's always hard to tell if people are having their coffee breaks, their coffee in the morning or their dinner. So it's great to continue in the second day of GHOU. It's very exciting week. And today is my privilege to introduce to you Robert Massey. It's a person I know and admire for quite some time. He is the Deputy Executive Director of the Royal Astronomical Society, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know if you're still holding this position. I know that his hometown is Bristol, a city that I love. My daughter used to live there, and I visited it, and both of us are completely in love with the town. So much culture, so many things happening, going on there. The world has a different flavor there. Robert has a PhD in that was done in Manchester, studying Orion Nebula, but he also worked in teaching, in local politics, and as a public astronomer for the Royal Observatory in Greenwich. I know he does some science journalism and very well done. He writes books. He actually recently published a book devoted to the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 landing. You should read the book. The book is really very nice. I have the Kindle version of it. He likes exercising and keeping a healthy mind. And last but not least, he is the person that helped us with the small grant scheme that enabled us to facilitate the Global Hands-on Universe for free to everyone. So the 600 participants that have registered, or almost 700, can now participate for free and benefit from all the sharing and share all the different ideas as we have been witnessing for the last 24 hours, and we'll witness even more. So Robert is going now to give us his keynote speech, which is devoted to public astronomy in an online world, unexpected opportunities from a global crisis. I know we all know that this was a good opportunity for us, but let's listen for someone that has a great expertise in public astronomy. Robert, thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you, Rosa. I will just share my screen. Is that working? Because that's always
yes,
the
perfectly.
2021 question, isn't it? Thank you.
Perfectly.
And is my sound okay? I think it is.
Everything's okay.
Excellent, thank you. Well, Rosa, you know, your words are kind and I feel slightly unjustified, but nonetheless flattering, which I guess is always a good start to any talk at all. When I was asked to do this, I happy to take up the opportunity. And then you sort of sit there and think about, what can you bring to this? So I thought what I would do. I should also say, by the way, we're very happy to be sponsoring the conference. It's an absolute pleasure to be linked into this. But anyway, I thought what I should do is think about how the world has changed for us. Obviously referring, as you would expect, to the specific UK examples that I'm familiar with, but I suspect they're not very different for others. And then to think about some of the lessons from that and some of the things that we didn't expect, actually, that, we see as opportunistic and that actually has really helped us improve our practice and offered us really big lessons for the future, I think. So I'm not going to be entirely upbeat and optimistic. There are some negative things associated with this. But, overall, it's a good picture, but I think we need to think more deeply about what it means in the future. Obviously, this conference is a great example of how we can do online working. It's just that, we need to consider the pitfalls too. So, you would be very surprised as a sponsor if I didn't tell you something about the Royal Astronomical Society. Our central mission is to advance astronomy and geophysics. And the second of those comes from the fact that I think in the early 20th century, there was an emerging science of studying the Earth as a planet. And at the time, for whatever historically quirky reason, we really do need to find this out properly, the Earth as a planet was considered, therefore, to fit in with our remit, because the other planets were something that the RAS was considering as well. And we are now the oldest continuously existing astronomical society. There are examples of others that were founded before us, but they didn't necessarily survive. So we've been going for more than 200 years now. We were established back in 1820. We have more than 4,000 members who have the slightly archaic name Fellows. It's just the way we were set up in the UK and around the world. And I think something like a quarter to a third of our fellows are from other countries other than the UK. We do have a very diverse membership, and also, we have a lot of amateur astronomer members as well, and people like teachers and science journalists, historians too. Anybody essentially with some kind of advanced or professional interest in astronomy is welcome to join. We don't open it up to everybody because it would be, actually in my view, slightly unfair to take their money for something they wouldn't necessarily benefit from. And you'll see from the picture on the right there that our current president is a woman, only I think the fourth one that we've had, Professor Emma Bunce, who is a planetary scientist from the University of Leicester, and her whole term of office has been online only. I can't imagine how strange it must be going through this, but she became president-elect, met us face-to-face for a brief period of time, and then since then she's been doing everything online. Her term of office will finish next May, and I wonder to what extent we'll see her face-to-face in that time. Probably not very much. But she has been very effective nonetheless for all of that. Sorry, excuse me while I just make sure my slides advance. There we go. So our bicentenary year, this was 2020, 200 years old. Like all good organizations, when you reach these kind of milestones, you want to think about the kind of things you can do well, about how you can celebrate that, and actually also just have a celebration for staff and people. There's nothing wrong with that kind of thing. It's the context is that we were founded in 1820 by people including William Herschel, but also Charles Babbage and other distinguished scientists as well. There was a group of men. This was the early 19th century. Now, I'm sorry to say that's how things worked at the time, and for us was the case until the First World War. We were founded in a building that sadly no longer exists, called the Freemasons Tavern, which actually appears to have been a pub that was popular enough that other organisations, including the Football Association in the UK, was set up as well while it exists, but it's no longer there. But on the right there is a note from the gentleman that sat down to dinner to set up the RAS. And William Herschel was our first president, but never actually chaired a meeting because he was pretty old by then. He died soon afterwards. So let's see if I can make the next slide. There we go. It quite seems to connect through as much as we like. So to celebrate this kind of thing, then, you tend to think about things that will benefit you and partying, and that's absolutely fine and legitimate. If you've been doing it that long, it's nice to reward members and staff and so on. But also we wanted to do wider things, and we have done that, I think, very successfully with projects like this. This is RAS 200 Sky and Earth, which was set up or started going in 2015 with the first call for grants. We set aside what was a lot of money for us, £1 million, to fund projects predominantly in the UK, but also in a couple of cases in Ireland and South Africa. We didn't bar other countries from applying for it. It's just that it ended up naturally having that kind of focus. And the aim of this was to be, you could have a whole presentation on this in its own right, Frankie, but the aim of this was to move to a community-led model. So we had the idea that these community partners, who include things like a prison charity, Bounce Back, the National Youth Agency, Girl Guiding UK, the Workers' Education Association, which is an adult education association, Prince's Trust, which specialises in young people not in education, employment or training, to key target group, adult carers, and Welsh language organisations, for example. The aim was that they would steer the project. So, typically in the UK at least, a lot of the big grant schemes tended to be things that were initiated by the scientists. And we wanted to have a different model whereby, yes, of course you need that kind of input, but the community organisations shape it. And so these were going, naturally, as you would imagine, pretty well. And we were due to celebrate them in a big way in 2020, which we did in part, but not in the way that we'd like. We started off the year with some nice face-to-face celebrations in the cold months that marked the beginning of 2020. Nice things we've done around that include things like this commemorative stamp set up here, which we also did for our 150th anniversary. It seems like a very niche thing, but they're remarkably popular, and we commissioned, we worked very closely with Royal Mail, who produced them in the UK. They got an artist in to do these wonderful renditions of discoveries in astronomy and planetary science that were associated with people living here, which was a nice, fantastic way to do it. It's a great set of stamps, actually. They sent us, as you can imagine, 3 packs when we worked on it. That's been really popular. We had a planetarium face-to-face in the courtyard. Again, it seems so naive, doesn't it? In February 2020, this was absolutely the way to do things, and we had big plans for it across the rest of the year. And we had a programme of public lectures that were up and running around the UK. And those of you familiar with the IAU will know Ed Gomez, who delivered, I think, possibly our only one that ran on that basis. I think maybe we did 2 in Cardiff on the science of Doctor Who. So, one of the other themes of the year was that we relentlessly want to emphasise that we're not just an organisation for the capital city of the UK, that we have a UK and indeed a global reach. And then, as is well documented, COVID-19 struck and the world changed. I'm not going to dwell on the merits of the discussions around the policy response to the pandemic and the rest of it, which I'm sure most people would find very variable, depending on where you live in the world. But suffice it to say that in the UK, as with many, many other countries, we've had a high number of cases, and it's come in 3 waves, and we're in the middle of the third wave now. The only difference, of course, is that so many people are now vaccinated, so some kind of measure of normality has returned. But we still have serious instances, and I think it will be, for us, the Royal Astronomical Society, my guess is that we will not return to some kind of normal until probably early next year. It really depends on how those case numbers are, not just because the rollout of the vaccine and any issues around that, but also because we have an older membership in many cases. Many of them will be reluctant, I suspect, not necessarily to come to our premises, but to travel in crowded trains and all of those things. So it remains to be seen. But I think the challenge of this will stay in force for at least the autumn months and to some extent beyond. It's because of international travel and all the issues that are associated with that. So what did we do in response? Well, the sort of sarcastic reply was, well, everybody went to home working very rapidly, which of course we did. And, I think some people might imagine that we then decided to take it as one long vacation and sit on the beach. And I can absolutely assure you that's not the case. If only actually because beaches in the UK don't tend to be super warm. So the idea that you would sit and sun yourself with a laptop probably isn't going to be practical, except for a couple of weeks a year. So we did not do this, even if sometimes people assume that it became that kind of lifestyle. It definitely has not, at least not so far. What we did instead was take a whole series of very practical and very, very rapid measures. And I think actually one of the lessons I think the conference delegates should think about in this, and the astronomical community more generally, is that we did a lot of the things that we talked about for a long time. We moved very, very rapidly to a home working model because we had to, because the government was telling us to. There were only a very few exceptions to that. That included me. I'm pre-pandemic, I was in the office 2 or 3 days a week with some home working. So for me, it just meant doing that all the time. I didn't get back to the office for the first time for about 6 months, I think. I was actually slightly ill during the first wave. Might have been COVID, who will never know. So I was at home, then everything locked down. So that was it. I didn't get to see my colleagues or any of my colleagues face to face for 6 months. And we only had then occasional visits to the building by key staff. So a librarian, for example, you can't do things like neglect a library full of rare books, because if and when we open up properly again, if there are any RAS members on the school or anybody else actually, and you happen to be in London, then our library contains books from the 15th century and even earlier. I think it's a fantastic resource, and clearly you have to preserve that, even whatever else is going on in the world. So a few of us went in occasionally. We had to reassure our staff. It's difficult to describe, I guess, the level of anxiety that's associated with this, but we did reassure people we'd continue to pay them, that actually we would encourage even more flexible working. So because people's needs switch so quickly, you suddenly have to move to a workplace where you have to accommodate that. You want to keep your staff, they're doing a good job. There's absolutely no reason in operational terms why they can't work on that kind of basis. And we've done that ever since. I can't think of any major operational issues that have resulted, and I'm, the deputy director, I'd be aware of some of them. I just haven't seen them. The more of it is about kind of isolation and not connecting to people face to face, but not the way that we encourage home working and flexible hours. In my particular case, I've included a picture of my daughter that she let me take yesterday, which is she's no longer doing this. Will be back in regular school in the autumn, but she went through 2 long periods of homeschooling. And if you've ever done that, she's in what amounts to, described as year 6 in the UK, which is the period kind of at 10 and 11. So 11 to 12, so she turned 11 in that school year. But in that year and in the previous year, she had 2 long spells. So the first one was 6 months where she wasn't in the school at all, and that presents its own challenges, actually. I think we have worked very hard to deliver services for children and parents and families in that period, but actually I don't think we should underestimate the kind of psychological consequences associated with that. Children, they're on the whole pretty adaptable, but it is strange, and obviously in the earliest time in the pandemic, not being able to see friends as much was an issue. This, though, was an enduring one, and I think it's the one, how many parents would have expected their kids to be saying that they really missed school, and they did. It was very much a thing that the odd bit of online learning and stuff just wasn't cutting it in the same way. And that, takes me to my second bullet point, and I will talk about many examples of that for us in more depth. We switched everything overnight to online services. Now, what I find fascinating about that is that we spent so long pre-pandemic thinking about how to do this and whether it would be possible and what the response would be. And when the crisis came along, we did it. We just had to, and we did it overnight. My colleagues stepped up to the plate, investigated a load of what can you do with Zoom? We've got a Zoom subscription. How do we enhance this? How many more things do we need? Can we move all this stuff online? The answer, uniformly was yes. We had advice from some of our fellows elsewhere, like Stephen Wilkins in Sussex was leading various things, but we did it, and we moved all our public program on that way as well. So I think that kind of response demonstrates to us that there are enduring lessons here about A, how quickly you can change these things, and B, that a lot is possible that perhaps we didn't imagine was. I'm slightly reluctant to quote him, but there is certainly a contentious figure. But Winston Churchill made the point after the Second World War about not wasting a good crisis, and I think that's a lesson that policymakers and the astronomical community is no exception in thinking that should remember that we should take this stuff and think about how it matters for the future and how we can work differently as a result, and and also consider that critically how this has changed things. So I'll talk through some of the various programs we offer. You can find details of these on our website and on the on our YouTube channel as well. Just Google us; it's easy enough to find. The first of these, and I'll give due credit to my colleagues in our education outreach team, Sheila Kanani and Lucinda Offer. The first of these was developed by Sheila, and Lockdown Learning came up with the title. Rolled out nicely. We identified very rapidly, because some of us were working parents, that there was an absolute need for this, that the kind of provision for online learning in schools was extremely limited, particularly for many schools, particularly in the first lockdown. And so we felt it was absolutely incumbent on us to offer something, and also something perhaps that was rather different just from the routine learning, because when you're sitting in that grinding routine, you don't know necessarily whether your parents have the skills to deliver that kind of thing. Some do, some don't. Or subject matter awareness. And so it was really important to us that we were offering something to enrich that, which we did, and we covered cohorts all the way from early years right up to secondary levels. So, remarkably, we even had early year stuff because nurseries were closed too at one point in some cases. And all of those groups responded amazingly positively. We had guest speakers in. Of course, the other bonus of this has always been that it's much easier to bring in people whose working patterns simply wouldn't allow them to travel to a session, exception of people in London. And we would typically get, 70 kids in each session, and these were not webinars, these were Zoom meetings, so they were asking questions. Obviously, as you can imagine, that varies with age and shyness and all the other things that you'd expect in confidence, but they were participating. And over the course of that first tranche of it, we got in about 2,500 participants, which we saw as a really strong number. I mean, I should stress throughout this, all of our online engagement, and I know that's not unique, I'm not pretending it is for a second, I'm sure everybody's experience is similar, but our reach has greatly improved as a result. We reached far higher numbers than we had done before that. We developed things too, like video resources. This, by the way, was almost kind of my boss saying, we need some video. So we sat down and thought, what can we do for video? So we thought so people like me would sit down at home and think about astronomical events in the night sky and make a quick kind of 2 or 3 minute short video. We got them shorter in the end to go do better on social media, describing something that was in the sky. And this particular one was great, Comet Neo-wise, which was so fantastic for Northern Hemisphere observers last year. A brilliant, brilliant thing to go out and look once the restrictions had eased a bit here. Actually, I think it was the third comment video I made, because there had been two comments before that, and both of them fizzled out, which was slightly frustrating. And but when this one did come along, the third time lucky, it was obviously a brilliant result for people to go and see. It was very visible, even from urban areas, reasonably well, and a lot of public interest in that. And occasionally, when you create this kind of content, the nice thing is that some of the larger newspapers that you might otherwise not be particular fans of, like the Daily Mail, for example, link to it. And then you suddenly get tens of thousands of views. So, credit to my colleagues for doing work on social media and so on, but actually those kind of links made all the difference. We haven't done so many of those recently, and we probably should again. It's not incredibly hard. The editing and getting it to look nice is where the work comes in. We're also looking now at doing short clips for schools as well that we can share more widely. And we've worked with people like the BBC on that kind of thing. BBC Learning were very interested in talking to us last year in particular, because they had a kind of public responsibility to deliver a greater number of things too. There are some other great examples of things that I wouldn't necessarily have believed was possible, or that there would be public interest in. And this is one of them. We did live observing events, a few examples of this, but this one in particular I like. It's Chasing Shadows at Jupiter. It ran for an astonishing 6.25 hours, which I thought, well, it's crazy. I mean, you can't do a 6.25 hour live event, but we did. Lucinda, my colleague, did this. It just ran and worked really well. It had more than 11,000 views on YouTube, including very many live participants, some of whom must have been sitting there throughout. I guess, I don't know, what do? Do you just give it on while you're making dinner or something? I'm not sure. But there was enormous interest in this, like a huge number of questions. We just were approached, and we assembled this panel very quickly of experts in Jovian science connected to the infrared telescope facility on Mauna Kea in Hawaii, which of course then had the advantage that in the UK, the time zone difference meant it was the middle of the night when this was running during the day. He had experts on hand considering different areas and taking questions. Some of those were in Leicester, some in working with NASA, and the Emma Bunce was our president that I mentioned. She's also a mission principal investigator for the GHOU mission, which is the one that will go to the icy moons of Jupiter, getting there in 2030 or so. I think it's launching next year. And Sean Prosser, our librarian, who being in was able to access the kind of historical materials and present those to the public. So, to me, this has 11,000 views. I mean, that seems absolutely crazy to me, but it worked. It delivered what we wanted. And there is a astonishing public appetite for this stuff. As well, there have been, I should say as an aside, there have been surveys and news reports and so on suggesting interest in astronomy increased during the pandemic. Well, I haven't seen any good way of measuring that. But my hunch is that it's when people in particular were stuck at home, even if you were living in the city, if you had any outside space at all, or even a balcony or even a big window, you could look at things in the sky and realise that there was something beyond the world you were somewhat trapped in at that particular point in time. But that's just probably a bit of romantic speculation on my part. I suspect there's some truth in it, but maybe it'd be interesting to know if people investigate that in more detail. So this is another great example. I mean, there are others I'm going to have to miss out, but it's another fantastic thing as well. We tried to get a sort of deeper level engagement with some of the leading figures in the field, as you can imagine, again, predominantly UK scientists, planetary scientists, astrobiologists, and a lot of these particular ones here. And we set up a kind of conversation session for 15 to 16-year-olds. So these are students in the UK who will be moving on to their GCSE exams, their kind of first big set of exams, or Scottish, actually I should say Scottish ordinary level, but never mind, that's a typo, a mistake in my slide. So we wanted to inspire them and give them again something that was going beyond just the initial focus on the work, which they've all been struggling in different ways to do. And so we brought leading specialists in to talk to them, and it went, amazingly well. I mean, we got typically maybe 50 to 100 people engaging again in a Zoom meeting where they could type in questions, at least if they didn't want to ask them, and you have the usual things about some people keeping their cameras off and that kind of thing. But they were highly engaged with it. And typically several hundred views on YouTube afterwards are not going to be very high in that case, because if you're not an active participant, it's probably something you get less out of. But I think what I liked about it was that we encouraged the scientists just to say a little bit about their work, and then to kind of offer personal reflections on how they'd arrived at the position they were in. So they were then saying, well, this is how I got to be a scientist looking at Jupiter, or how I got to be an astrobiologist, and giving those kind of general reflections to demonstrate, I guess, that they were ordinary people too, that they have the kind of juggling that ordinary people need to do, and so that therefore perhaps that sort of Superman or Superwoman image that people can sometimes get from the most successful scientists, demonstrating that actually, yes, they have the same issues that everybody else to some extent, and they had to juggle their lives in the same way. It would be a bit odd if I didn't mention the fact that our scientific meeting program continued too, that we were able to run that almost entirely as normal. Again, we switched to this overnight. It's crazy, we talked about doing this for years and years, and suddenly we just thought, okay, we've got to do it, technical equipment aside, we will just do this, and we did. And it's, and with some glitches, it's run incredibly successfully. We delegate the chairing of it to the meeting organisers, because we certainly haven't got the staff to sit and support it all day in that way. And we get several hundred participants each time. Now that's actually a big increase typically on what we used to get, which could be would still be a very valid and deep and great connecting meeting, but perhaps 30 people in the room, and it's ballooned. And of course, then they also, in some cases, if we ask our organisers to edit the meetings and the rest of it, but once those are edited, you can watch them later. You can have the access to the content after, just as we have with conferences like this. And the ordinary meetings are the more plenary things that I mentioned, because they're more popular too, including things like our AGM and so on. We're now adept at doing that kind of stuff online. And even this year, we've had about 3,500 people attend those. So the size of several major conferences. I mean, I think this is one of the things the RAS does very well, is that it runs a program of scientific meetings over the whole year. And in the UK, at least, we're quite unusual in that case. Even the bigger scientific societies don't tend to do that as much, because they don't see it as such a priority. But for us, it's just been part of our tradition. One of those meetings in 1919 that Reza Doran will remember is where we announced the verification of general relativity. So sometimes they're really big things. And on that note, I'm not going to compare the two, because I know this is wildly contentious, but we made a point of trying to be relevant to not just the wider public and schools and parents and learners and so on, but the media too during this. And it's been more of a challenge because so much news was about COVID. But we did have a fantastic session on the phosphine, tentative discovery of phosphine in the atmosphere of Venus. I mean, I say tentative. Jane Greaves, who is the lead scientist on this, is a friend of mine. Will probably kill me for saying that, but I know it's still very contentious. Although she would certainly argue that it's more definitive than some of the reports have said. So we kept this secret for 2 years, which was a lot of fun. And the original plan, as you can imagine, was to run a face-to-face conference and offer journalists coffee and muffins and things in the morning. And that was completely impossible. So instead we switched to a virtually entirely online thing. And it was during a kind of a gap between waves in the pandemic last autumn. And was actually able to go to Sandex and Joan and introduce her, which was great, over in Cardiff. And talk about the discovery of this phosphine gas, which they argue is not necessarily. I mean, they're very cautious about this. They don't say this is life on Venus, but they say it's a biomarker, and if it's there, it needs further investigation. Might be that it's completely unrelated and all the rest of it, and there's enough debate going on if you look in various papers around that. But, it was an important thing to announce. Needless to say, as you can imagine, although the secret was out about a week before and people were tweeting about it, we didn't comment. We held the embargo because we thought we're not going to just pander to this. And that gave us, 250,000 people logging in and watching the press conference over time and so on. And even the explainer video associated with it has been watched more than 100,000 times. So, an enormous reach for us. Yes, it's a big and major scientific discovery. I should also say we worked very closely with the team in Hawaii at the East Asian Observatory, who did a fantastic job, and at MIT too, and other partners in the UK in particular. And then, although our bicentenary celebrations were interrupted, they came back, and came back, I think, pretty well, considering. National Astronomy Week was a nice event for us in the UK in the autumn, in November. About 1,000 people attended, up to 1,000 people attended a series of live events, about 2 a day over 9 days. And we would typically have a family one in the morning and then one for adults in the afternoon with a more, I use the word adult theme, I don't mean it in the sense you might think, but just, at a higher level of conversation, and that varied enormously, really covering everything from hard science through to culture and the arts and kind of people's responses to the Red Planet. We had our postponed Herschel organ recital because William Herschel, as well as being an astronomer and the grand scale, was also an organist and composed the music and so on. And so we were able to do a live rendition of that. Unfortunately, we couldn't have anybody going to watch it, which is a great shame, which I'll mention in a minute. But nonetheless, that was a nice way to do it, to actually emphasise that we were doing more in our bicentenary year than just doing the minimum. We're actually trying to be celebratory. And then finally, our podcast, which was recording very, very successfully in the council room of the RAS and doing clips in the library for the first 3 months, going in, looking at wonderful historic resources, immediately had to move online as well. And thanks to the purchase of the Zencaster software and some really high-end microphone equipment, which we got just before the suppliers stopped being able to get it for us, we've continued that very well, and it's still running to this day. We've now had, I'm say, well over 100,000 downloads. I don't have the precise figure, but I know it reached that about 3 months ago. So it's fantastically popular. It's been a great way to continue our connection. Our NAM conference, our National Astronomy meeting, this was going to be one of the defining bicentenary events. We were going to invite everybody to Bath. We're hoping for a huge conference, and we're going to include tours of William Herschel's house and all these wonderful historic sites and enjoy these cultural events. And of course, we compromised on that a lot. It became an entirely virtual conference. Firstly, we cancelled it last year just to give us ourselves some space. We hoped to run it face to face this year. That didn't happen. In July, we thought the risks are just too high, so we went for virtual only. And, it worked great, brilliantly. I think 950 delegates, and bearing in mind that, they were paying delegates, we had to offer them something that was good value using the Hopin platform, worked pretty well. And, it's just a great shame that we weren't able to be in that setting for the conference, but it did, work fantastically. We had nice media coverage, some really amazing plenary speakers as well, who I think we would have struggled to get. I think we wouldn't have got someone like Stefan Alexander, who at the time was talking to us from the Caribbean. I don't imagine he would have wanted really to travel to the UK just to give a talk to us and then fly home again, unless he had some very good other reason to do it, which is another thing I will return to. And you can see there an extract of his talk on the jazz of physics, from jazz to the cosmos. Absolutely a fantastic speaker, by the way, if you haven't seen him already. And I think as a plenary one, that is available for free online now. So our reach, as you would expect, along with, past estimates in this course, is a fantastic demonstration of that. Our reach is much, much better than it's been historically. One of the things we are criticised for is that we, as I said earlier on, are a London-centric organisation, and that's not the case. I don't live in London. Actually, the majority of my colleagues don't either, because they were priced out at various points. So many of us are commuting in on one basis or another. But it's not just about reaching other cities in the UK. Although it's a developed country with good infrastructure by global standards, you still have remote areas like Scottish Islands, the Highlands of Scotland, the Welsh Mountains, areas with poor internet connectivity doesn't help with that. But it has enabled us, despite those limitations, to reach people in a much bigger way than we would have done before. Some of the projects at RAS200 were supposed to do that, but it's still a hard thing to do. And globally, we've been successful with that as well. As with this meeting, the main limitation has been time zone differences for live sessions. But in our lockdown learning ones, for example, we did, because it was the evening in the Far East, we did get participants in places like South Korea, I think Australia, certainly India, and then, at the other end of the day, the USA and so on. And, South Africa is relatively easy. It's only a 2-hour time difference. But so that's been something we wouldn't have been able to do before, even if we wanted to, and it's been a great plus for us. It's something we don't want to shed. And to cite that particular Venus one, because of the time of day, we deliberately put it in the afternoon. 36% of our audience was from the US, only 10% from the UK, and then for other European countries, that's slightly badly phrased there, each of those would have typically 3 or 4% of our audience, and then in African and Middle Eastern countries, from low percentages up to about 2%. So really, really big reach, and the vast majority of people were not in the UK, and we're very happy with that. We want to now and again demonstrate that we're actually not just a national organisation. So I want to move on to a couple of other points on this that I think to bring this towards the end. But that I'd like us to think about a bit more in all of this. There tends to be a very celebratory view in astronomy of the way, the way that this has worked. And I think that's entirely justified. There are many, many good things that have come out of this. But I want to, though, refer you to the fact that it isn't working for everybody, that, this is fine if you have good internet access and good equipment. And if you don't, then there is very much a genuine digital divide. That actually internet access in the UK, at least I can't believe it isn't true elsewhere in the world, is strongly related to social class. So the household income is a very good measure of how likely you are to be online and to access the best facilities. So during the pandemic, Ofcom, which is the telecoms regulator in the UK, found, for example, that 37% of the households, the lowest income, so social class is D and E, it means unskilled and semi-skilled and unskilled labour, basically. With those households with children, they have either a poor or no connection at all. In many cases, the IFS is the Institute for Physical Studies, children are often only accessing the internet through a mobile phone. And that might be a family one, or there might be a couple in the family. But what happens if you've got 3 or 4 kids? 2/5 of those households in the poorest families, the 14% by the way is overall, but 2/5 of the households in the poorest families have no desktop, laptop or tablet. So, people like me sitting there, my daughter's got her own bedroom to herself. She's got access to a tablet. She had no problem accessing the content. But I think of many of her peers who were dependent on things, because, she goes to a state school, dependent on things like printed resources, where the other kids were getting the online learning. It's an absolute gross division that we'd never normally have tolerated. Might have been necessary this time, but the resources for those families were inadequate, certainly for much of the pandemic. So the Sutton Trust, is another food for figure of thought for you here. That's a charity that looks at state schooling, basically, and the kind of educational divisions. 3/10 of children in middle-class homes were accessing online lessons. Not a high figure, actually. No, in our case, in the first lockdown, we didn't get very much of that either. But, I'm not going to deny that there would be inherent advantages in my house compared with others. And would compare with only 1/6 in working class homes. So, automatically we saw these big divisions. And if you look at this division between the state and the private sector, it's even starker. In the first lockdown, 57% of private school pupils were accessing online lessons, twice as many as in the state sector. So money was buying you access and a quality of education in an even more stark way than usual. You were much more likely in a private school to be sitting there having a whole program of lessons than you were in the state sector. So my argument is there is very definitely a digital divide. There has been some political efforts to address this. So there was a program of supplying laptops to the poorest households, although that provision was later cut, and you can see various head teachers in the UK and schools are very annoyed about it. Some of the broadband providers offered additional support, and that's patchy enough, but it's still, I suppose there's still the issue of how you're doing that. Are you doing it via a dongle on broadband, or are you doing it via tethering to a phone? How are you actually getting to do this? Are you getting that quality of content access, let alone the geographical issues about where you are in rural and urban areas and so on? But there is now, the thing that's described a lot now, and it's been taken up by MPs in the UK Parliament and so on, is that there might be an enduring legacy, that some of the peoples who've been through this may be permanently disadvantaged. So, all the wonderful things we've produced, to return it to astronomy, there may be some of those peoples will never see it, or they see it much later. They didn't have that enriched learning that we were so proud of. And the question then is who we were benefiting. I'm not saying there's much we could have done about that, but I do think it's a factor in, as we look forward, in who we should prioritise on the years ahead. So other issues for me, I guess, to think about are when this new online world, well, there are what I'd call softer issues in the sense that they're sometimes less quantifiable. But one of the big ones for me is, is virtual networking really any good? I've been to enough online conferences now, and I sit there and I look at things like the coffee breaks and that kind of thing, and I think, I don't know, a lot of me wants to go and have a real coffee and get away from my laptop, not join a GatherTown thing, although it's quite fun. It's a bit like a game my daughter plays called Among Us, where you sort of throw people into space and things. It's not a real substitute, and I think we haven't quite cracked that. And I don't think it's necessarily a lack of willingness on the part of delegates and scientists and so on, but just a way of thinking about what would actually make it something you want to do. You know, if you're spending your entire life sitting at your home desk in front of the laptop, it's obviously not, you know, despite the theme of this conference, it's obviously not directly, at least, hands-on. You know, it's not multi-sensory in the way that we'd like, you know, at least in terms of touch, smell and taste and so on. And although there are some great tutorials out there and demonstrations to drive home learning, you know, it's clearly not the substitute we'd like. There's something very, very inspiring about, you know, even walking amongst a group of children or adults or other learners, just thinking, you know, to try and motivate them. It's much harder to do that, I think, when you're doing this online. And we don't have those informal conversations, and it's much harder, you know, if we're honest about it. The workplace has changed for that, and I think it's a really difficult thing to do online. You know, setting it up, it always feels slightly contrived, and we're not. I don't think we're over that yet. I had an amazing experience of just having coffee with my boss last week, you know, for the first time since the pandemic began, and we in a cafe, you know, we sat and chatted, and that was valuable. And of course, you explore those things you just don't do on a more formal call. I think as well, there are particular challenges there are benefits and challenges for, say, disabled learners and special educational needs learners. In the UK, that's described as SEND. This has obviously been a boon for people with limited mobility. You know, if you're not able to travel to the capital for whatever reason, partly in some cases just simply down to cost, or just that, you know, time, or that you have access, you know, mobility issues that make it impractical for you generally, then this has been great, and the material is there forever, so it's there in perpetuity, you can access it. But we shouldn't deny the fact that there are some groups that really struggle with this. If you're hearing impaired, even with subtitles, this is not necessarily going to be the best way that you can view content. You know, I know we have a hearing impaired member of our governing council who relies on lip reading, and she has struggled. You know, there's no doubt about that. She finds it very difficult, even with these facilities brought into place. It's even harder for people in that position than it normally would be. And there are particular challenges for, say, children with special educational needs, you know, whether that's physical or mental, you know, whatever kind of differences you're talking about here. And those are hard to address. There have been good examples, one on the right here that I was involved with is from the Lightyear Foundation that I used to chair and as chair of trustees that until last year, and they produced kind of things like space, dance and so on. They're trying to use you know, physical exercises and green screens and so on to bring that to children's homes. That got some great national coverage, but it is difficult, and you know, I think that's one aspect of it that is much harder to replace in the world we're now in. My final point I want to make about a plus from this, and one that I don't think we should dismiss, is the impact on the climate emergency. You know, now globally, I know that emissions dipped a little bit, and now they're back up, and production and so on has not shifted as much as we'd like. But actually, for us as individuals, I suspect we've seen a much more positive benefit because of the nature of our work. So, as it happens, we were doing work in this area already, and then then 2020 came along. So we ended up, as you can imagine, assessing everything online. My colleagues are very good about describing all their different activities, and we measured it across the board. And we went to an outside consultancy to help us with that. And we took 2019 as a typical year because, you know, 2020 clearly wasn't. 2021 isn't either. Don't know whether next year will be. And we found that, like many, many astronomers, we have a pretty high per capita output. You know, some astronomers are compared to global business people, and certainly some of the most active researchers, at least pre-pandemic, in terms of the impact they had. 13.5 tonnes per employee CO2 emissions in 2019, which is more than twice the UK average. You can see 5.5 tonnes, and not great, well above the net zero target, which is 2 tonnes and per person per year. And but actually, you know, not so out of line with astronomers in general. You know, you can see 18 tonnes for a Max Planck Institute counterparts there. There's a paper by Kanudianka. This is all in a special edition of Nature Astronomy. And in the case of Australian astronomers, you know, 37 tonnes. And that's partly because they have more travel, but also because it's a sort of carbon-rich economy, and that things like supercomputing facilities and so on, many of them are not being powered by renewable sources. So we had a challenge there, and our biggest sources were not a massive surprise, although in one case, you know, slightly what I wasn't expecting. 55% of our total came from flights, and a lot of that's supported by travel grants. The kind of way in which my colleagues and myself go to the office, almost all of us going on public transport or cycle, walk, or in one case use a motorbike. It's not high carbon impact at all, but we support a lot of flying. One of the big things we do that our community has liked a lot is that we pay travel grants so people can go to conferences. And of course, the direct result of that is a lot of associated CO2 emissions. So we're now considering how we might change that in the future and say, at least for European meetings, encourage travel by low carbon means and so on. Perhaps set an overall carbon budget for that stuff, which would be, by the way, there's only thoughts that we're having, and none of this is definitive yet, but I'd like to do it. Our old building as well, unfortunately, though it's beautiful, produced about a quarter of the total. We were able to act on that by moving to a more renewable electricity source, but we still have to heat the place, and that's non-trivial. And funny enough, our magazine, we didn't expect this, our magazine made up 8% of our CO2 emissions because it's printed, mostly goes to people in the UK, but at least 1,000 people around the world get it, and it gets flown to them. So this was an interesting point for us to try and address, and we're thinking about, whether or not really a very delayed postal service is better than an online version, and perhaps we should be more 2021 about it. And our progress on this, as unsurprisingly, has been driven by COVID. I mean, I'm being a little unfair on myself and my colleagues here. We have started to review how things will happen when we go back to some kind of new normal, but just the very fact that international travel was banned, or effectively banned, reduced emissions by 87% last year, entirely due to COVID. Nobody, as far as I know, has taken advantage of a travel grant to go to an international conference in the last year. We did then sign the Climate Neutral Now Declaration anyway, which pledges cuts that you can see outlined there. Some people think they're not very ambitious. I probably tend to agree, but that's something we'll review in due course. So by 2030, we want to cut those by half. But we are now publicly pledged to do this. And I think it is that big lesson for the pandemic. We have managed this throughout 2020 and most of 2021. I don't think we can argue that we could return entirely to the previous mode of working. Time zone disadvantages, face-to-face stuff, and all. This is indefensible if we're scientists. If we believe in the science of climate change, then we have to lead by example.
Robert, you should be wrapping up so you can take a couple of questions.
I will definitely do that. This is essentially the last slide, I think. So, so my next thing then is, our future conferences will all be hybrid or virtual. There are issues around the atmosphere that you can see as an example there, how that works, but they will all be. I think we need big investment in capital and staff, unfortunately, associated with that. You might be looking at 6-figure investment to get very good cameras and remote steerable microphones and so on. But it does have the advantage of much greater reach for us, that it allows us to bring in those international speakers that we couldn't before. It enables a greater audience than as we've seen, and it actually slightly depressingly helps things like visa issues. If you ever come from a global south country and try to come to the UK to attend things like a conference, I know that's not always easy. I'm not proud of that at all, but if this enables participation, it helps a bit. And as I mentioned, there's the benefit of a reduction in CO2. So I will leave it there because that is my last slide, I think. There you go, except to credit my colleagues who've done so much fantastic work and show you how to contact them. But I just want to end by saying, let's think about what this means and what the lessons are for the future, and let's review it critically and try and make the post-pandemic world a different one. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Robert. That was actually very inspiring and eye-opener. There are many things that we don't consider when we think about this virtual meetings. Some of them we feel in our skin, some of them we don't. But I think you have shown the good and bad side of the pandemic, which I think I appreciate it a lot, and I'm sure the audience as well. You can put your questions on the Q&A, and you can put your questions to Robert here in the chat as well, as I will follow. There's one question by Nurali that's asking about the lectures, the RSA lectures, if they are available for viewing. And I guess that goes also for many of the other things that you have described during the presentation.
Yeah, I mean, so as a rule, we now have, we didn't do it before because it involved more complicated recording, but virtually everything we do now just goes on YouTube, so you can find it there. If you have any difficulty tracking it down, just let me know, and I'll try and find out or ask for help, but virtually everything does. There are one or two exceptions. Sometimes we did a really successful event with a book, a children's book, Look Up, and that had 15,000 kids on it. But because it was a commercial publication, the organisers insisted that it was taken down after a week, so we couldn't leave it up there. But largely, most of the stuff from our conferences, meetings, and so on is available online and comes up at different periods of time as it gets edited. But our central aim, is to make it all as available as possible.
We have no other questions too, but I have a question for you. I know that you're a big advocate of opening the eyes of politicians towards the importance of astronomy for everything, for development, for culture, for societal issues, for digital divide problems. How do you consider that the pandemic affected this mission of the Royal Astronomical Society of creating a more in-depth empathy toward the importance of astronomy and space exploration?
Yeah, I think the answer is there's two strands to this. So on the one hand, the science looked a lot less relevant because people said, well, look, we're fighting the pandemic, and obviously the focus of the media, the public, and the rest of it was a lot of their attention was on that, funding vaccines and all the rest of it, things I would hardly argue against. I think, on the other hand, we want to encourage people to reflect a bit and say, thinking about that better world, perhaps, trying to say, look, you've been unable to fly to these more natural, pristine landscapes this year. So maybe you have to value those nearer to your homes more. Maybe you have to think about issues like light pollution a bit more. For example, there was a parliamentary paper on tackling light pollution in the UK during 2020. And I think it's probably keeping the focus on that is our challenge, that we say, look, you go through this big crisis, things will hopefully return to some kind of normal again. We get to the point where travel becomes easier. We shouldn't take it for granted in the way that we once did. But actually that our natural environment, when we've been stuck at home in urban settings largely, we realise how important it is. All the wildlife organisations in the UK have seen big growth in membership, at least that's what they say. And I'm sure that's attributed to the fact that we had to explore our localities more. And perhaps then we get that appreciation of, well, you shouldn't have to travel a long way to see a decent night sky, to experience the phenomena in the night sky. And they are inspiring. It reminds people that there was more than their locality, that they could, that they could enjoy it where they were. But actually, it says, this is an enduring science. This is something that inspires us to think about a future beyond all this. We don't want to be in a world where we just think about COVID. We want to think about the climate emergency, if nothing else. I think the counter argument is very much along those lines. That actually it's appreciating what we have and being able to do that from the homes we live in.
I think you've done a wonderful job, and you actually showed to us how your reach went from a very local reach to a more broader audience. Do you think that scientists also have this, because usually not all the scientists will be willing to have their share of public outreach. Do you think that the pandemic created a better opportunity for them to understand the importance of public outreach and of sharing the science that they do in terms of explaining to the taxpayer where their money is going, but also to inspire new generations of scientists of the importance of it?
Yeah, I think it certainly made it easier, and I guess perhaps in part because, not just schools, but obviously universities were closed and so on. They couldn't see their students face to face. They had to think creatively about how they were doing that teaching. And I know that's been pretty burdensome in many cases, but perhaps it made them, the scientific community, perhaps we've realized that this is a great route, that actually, sometimes you don't even have to leave your home to do something that can make you quite inspiring and fascinating. And, all the limitations I've set out aside, I think that has been really powerful. And I've been really impressed by the fact we've been able to get in such fantastic people from around the world that we would not have been able to do otherwise. We might have, in our regular things, we might have got one or two really impressive keynote international speakers at some expense, and we've been able to pepper our conferences with them. We've been able to bring them into the homes of children and families in a way that wasn't possible before. So I guess the answer to your question is I'm not sure whether, it'd be interesting to know whether more people were doing it or not. I don't know if there's numbers on that, but anecdotally, I guess that my expectation is that it will turn out to have been the case, that we've seen a greater willingness to engage in this way.
Yeah, I guess there's a big mission in our hands. Like, look at the Global Hands-on Universe. We never expected to have the success story we had last year and this year, but all of a sudden we found out that the answer was there all the time. People were willing to do that, and now we have the opportunity to not only share with people from all over the world the things that we have been sharing locally and reaching out to only a few people, but also learn about things that are being done in places where you have privileged people, privileged societies, but places where the digital divide might have a cost, and maybe there are so many solutions out there that we never thought before. So we're giving a stronger voice to many people in the world, and that is a very nice outcome of COVID. If I can say there was something good, that was it. Yeah. Well, I don't know if there is any other question. I don't see any other question in the Q&A, also not in the chat. I really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you very much for accepting, Robert. That was indeed eye-opening and came with lots of information for us to digest and think. Please keep thinking globally while acting locally, and supporting the good initiatives that you have been doing. Thank you very much for your participation.
Thanks, Rosa.
And we are 4 minutes ahead of time, but I guess I will hand over the session back to Gustavo or Catan. I see Gustavo has the microphone open.
Yeah, no, it was just thank you, Robert, for the presentation, and thank again the Royal Astronomical Society for the grant that made this conference possible to be free for everyone. And I think this is really important initiatives like the RES small grant scheme to foster new innovative ways to engage people in science that the world really needs more science and science education and science literacy. Okay, we have a few more minutes before the break, but I just want to calm everyone that is writing here on the chat about the workshop links. Okay, so it was sent to all of you who registered for session 3, this morning, the workshops that will happen in an hour. I'll send you again. Okay, make sure everybody receives. Check your spam folder, please, because it might have landed there. But don't worry, I'll send you again. And even if you don't receive it in the next minutes, you can write directly to me, and I'll make sure you receive the link for the workshops. Okay, don't worry, it will work out fine. Okay, any more questions, comments before we go for the break? I think we could use a bit longer break. Okay, nobody will complain. So enjoy your break, and we'll be back in 30 minutes for the next set of presentations. 8 minutes, I think. I mean.